Hey guys, Derek and
here.
from a guy, a girl, and a camper van. So spring has finally sprung. And as we've mentioned before, one of the biggest reasons why we wanted to buy our new little cabin with some land is because we want to be food self-sufficient. And our way that we're going to do that is by putting in, hopefully, a pretty big garden. Which is why today, we're out in the middle of our forest. Makes sense, right? No? Oh. Well, hopefully it will by the end of this video. To the uninitiated, a vegetable garden should seemingly only require about 4 things: dirt, sunshine, seeds, and water. But if you've ever researched gardening online, you've likely discovered that this simple topic will provide no shortage of options or opinions. Probably the most popular technique is the conventional tilled garden, a typically rectangular patch of black soil with precise rows of colorful vegetation. This method requires fairly little work to set up, but must be watered and weeded regularly. And as the name suggests, it requires annual tilling of the soil and the addition of nutrients, compost, and fertilizer in order to keep things growing smoothly. The next most popular is the raised bed garden, essentially a large box constructed of wood or cinder blocks and filled with soil. Because it's often used in conjunction with the square foot gardening technique, this method is great for those with less space, as it allows for much more food to be grown within a smaller footprint. Plus, the increased height of the garden bed means less bending, the soil warms up quicker in the spring, and drainage is rarely a problem. Unfortunately, it requires a bit more construction work up front, and still requires watering, weeding, and usually a mending of the soil with compost or fertilizers. There are, of course, many variations, but most beginner gardeners will typically weigh the pros and cons of one of these 2 established techniques and then choose the one that best suits their situation. By now, it should come as no surprise that we rarely do things normally. Don't get me wrong, we don't buck trends just for the sake of being different, but are instead of the belief that just because it's conventional doesn't automatically mean that it's best. So instead, we like to research and experiment with alternative ideas as well. Now, before I continue, I should also mention that we are not absolute beginners, and this will not be our first attempt at growing food. A few years ago, Paula and I constructed a respectable hydroponic garden in our apartment to grow lettuce, basil, and other leafy greens. We had a lot of fun with this project and quite a bit of success, but unfortunately our limited space prevented us from reaching any level of food self-sufficiency. This time around, with space no longer an issue, we've decided to get a little bit closer to nature by experimenting with permaculture. So what the heck is permaculture? Well, there are a number of different definitions, and a thorough explanation could easily take hours. But for our purposes, we like to think of it as a philosophy of sustainable food production which works with nature instead of against it. In many ways, conventional gardening techniques struggle to control nature and bend it to our will, whereas permaculture strives to emulate the natural processes found in our environment and gently steer them in a direction which is beneficial to us. This is why we began in our forest, for both inspiration and materials. There are a variety of techniques within the permaculture realm, such as lasagna gardens, back to Eden gardens, food forests, etc. And we'll probably experiment with all of those over time. But for now, we've decided to start with a method called Hugelkultur. Hugelkultur is a German word meaning hill culture or mound culture, and in its most basic form is essentially just growing plants in a buried pile of decaying wood. This technique has been used by Eastern Europeans for hundreds of years, and by Mother Nature for millions. When a tree falls in the forest, its trunk and branches quickly become covered with discarded leaves in autumn. By the following spring, much of that organic material will naturally begin to compost, making a perfect home for moss, lichen, and fungus. Over time, the tree itself begins to decay, releasing nutrients into the thin soil layer above, where they are quickly absorbed by any sprouting seeds which just happen to have landed nearby. When it rains, the now soft and spongy wood soaks up the excess water and then slowly releases it to the germinating plant roots during periods of drought. Eventually, the smaller branches break down, leaving voids in the earth, resulting in naturally aerated topsoil. As the seasons pass, additional layers of leaves and other vegetation return to the forest floor and form a continuous layer of mulch, which in turn insulates the soil during the colder months and prevents evaporation during the warmer months. The entire process forms a self-regulated ecosystem with continual growth and absolutely no outside help from humans. There are no tillers, no watering cans, no chemicals, and no weeding. And yet forests have successfully covered the vast majority of the landmass of our planet. Or at least they did, until we came around. By following the philosophy of permaculture and the technique of Hugelkultur, we hope to provide ourselves with an abundance of organic food while still working in harmony with these natural processes. We began by selecting an appropriate location and orientation for our garden. We chose a spot on the edge of our field with dry soil and full sunlight throughout the day. Next, we measured an area about 30 feet long and 4 feet wide. The exact dimensions are not particularly important. The mound can be of any length that works for your property, but by being narrow, it makes it easier to maintain and harvest. Once we were satisfied with the location, we laid out a tarp, grabbed our shovels, and began removing the sod layer. By placing the sod on a tarp, it would be easier to reuse later on. Next, we laid out some more tarps and continued digging until we had created a trench about a foot deep. All of this digging was not strictly required for Hugelkultur, but as you will see, we would eventually need a layer of topsoil anyway, and decided to obtain it from our own land, rather than purchasing it elsewhere. This would save us money, give us some much needed exercise, and limit the amount of outside unwanted contaminants being added to our future food supply. Next, it was time to begin filling the trench with wood. And luckily, we had already busied ourselves with the laborious task of cutting down dead trees and other brush around the property. We decided that hauling all of this wood would be much easier with a tractor. And if you're gonna get a tractor, you might as well go for the best. Alright, so it's technically just an old lawn tractor, and a tiny one at that. But if there's one thing we learned from our almost 2 years of van life, it's the importance of appreciating and making do with whatever resources you happen to have at your disposal. So we dragged in cartload after cartload and eventually filled the trench with as much wood as it would hold. Then we went after some smaller branches. Once we were satisfied with the large logs and smaller branches, it was time to go after some wood that had already partially decayed in order to give our garden a bit of a head start. It's typically recommended to construct a new Hugelkultur mound in autumn so that it has the entire winter to begin decomposing and composting. But since we wanted our first harvest to be this year, we headed out into our forest in search of some dead trees that had already been lying on the ground for a year or two. We quickly found a large quantity of dead fallen birch trees. I think we just hit a jackpot.
All right, let's do it.
They were already soft and spongy and growing moss, so we filled up the dump cart and brought a load back to the field. This is a perfect example of why we're putting wood in our garden. As this little log decomposed, it's turning into rich nutrients for these plants that are now growing directly in the wood itself. That's awesome. Soon, our vegetables will be growing in this too. After another couple of cartloads of wood, we threw in some small green branches for good measure and then some composted material to fill in all the empty spaces between the logs. Luckily, the previous owners of our property had kept cows, and so there was a pretty big pile of leftover feed hay, which by the look of it, had been laying around for a few years. Once the cracks were sufficiently filled, it was time to make use of the sod we had removed. By layering the chunks upside down, we were able to utilize the rich soil in the roots and the nutrients stored in the grass, without much concern of it regrowing. But speaking of grass, since sections of the lawn had become overgrown and out of control, we decided to cut it down, gather it up, and spread it in a thick layer over the sod. From what we've read, this should help to smother the grass roots so that they break down in short order and don't cause any future problems. But I guess time will tell. Because the grass clippings were pretty dry, we figured this was a good time to give the whole mound a soaking. But first, we had to set up a hose. As we mentioned in our cabin tour video, the previous owners had installed a few hundred feet of water hose and electric cables through the air from the cabin back to where they had kept their cattle. This setup was clearly not up to code and a bit of an eyesore, so as one of our first priorities, we tore it all down. However, all of that hose still surprisingly held water, so we linked it all back up as a temporary measure, and we were watering our soon-to-be garden in no time. As a final step, we spread out another thick layer of fully composted hay and then covered the entire mound with the soil that we had originally dug out of the trench. So all that's left now is to cover everything with a layer of mulch and then put in the plants. But we'll show you that in the next video. This entire process took several days to complete and a lot of physical labor on our parts. But by doing it all by hand and taking our time, it made us feel a lot more truly connected with our garden, and I think gave us a greater appreciation for the powerful equipment we'll likely use when we build the next one.
We sure will. I have it on camera.